We are all familiar with the many war movies out there that attempt to show us casual citizens what fighting for your country in a real war truly does to a human being, coming in forms of Clint Eastwood's American Sniper, Catherine Bigelow's Hurt Locker, and even something tied closer to fiction like the complicated John Rambo character. It is a rather popular subgenre that receives well-done movies that can also achieve a faithful adaptation to the setting or real-life character. As much as these movies pull and thrash at my own heartstrings, nothing came or probably ever will come as close as Boardwalk Empire did almost a year ago now. If you know of the show, you might be a little surprised as the 5 seasons are focused on the Prohibition era and its exploitations, right? Well, for those of us who have actually watched, I'm sure could not forget the engaging first 2 seasons of the show that featured an amazing supporting character. In 2 seasons, Boardwalk Empire is able to express such a telling story of the vivid horrors seen by a young man joining the war for a greater cause. Without even showing a battlefield or armed military conflict, Boardwalk Empire pushes a brilliant, compelling story of the mentally abused James Jimmy Dormy. Jimmy Dormy is a fictional character of Boardwalk Empire that is played by Michael Pitt. Now, Pitt had not seen a lot of success in this point of his career. Most notably, he starred in the 2000 film Last Days as Blake, who mirrored Kurt Cobain of Nirvana in his last days. With his background in playing characters twisted or challenged, Michael Pitt was an incredible fit even with the lackluster past of his career. Enough about Michael Pitt though, let us get to who exactly Jimmy Dormy is. His backstory, for the sake of this video, is pretty simple. He's the son of the extremely powerful Commodore who basically owns Atlantic City, but this is unknown information for most of the show. His father figure would be the main character of the show, Nucky Thompson, played by the one and only Steve Buscemi. Nucky worked under the Commodore and would become a powerful figure himself as he was behind all of the underground crime during the Prohibition. Nucky, knowing who Jimmy was, took pity on him and would care for him when he was young, seeing some of his own self in Jimmy. Nucky would set up Jimmy to attend Princeton College so that he may one day take Nucky's place as a crime boss of Atlantic City. Unknown to Nucky though, Jimmy had other plans. After discussing his life briefly with the professor, Jimmy was inspired to take a grip onto his own life and enlist in the army as the US was getting into World War I. Jimmy would see a lot of battlefields as an infantry soldier and machine gunner. His leg would be severely damaged by a grenade and would lead Jimmy to having pain and a limp for the rest of his life. Unfortunately for Jimmy, his leg was nothing compared to what seeing men die in brutal terror had done to his mind. Jimmy came back home, but the Jimmy that had a son, a girlfriend, Nucky Thompson, and even a life had died. That Jimmy had died in a trench, like so many other valiant soldiers who have fought in every war. Many of us, like Nucky, could never understand what Jimmy truly felt all the way down into his soul. We can put it into words like he was tortured, abused, broken. We cannot, and hopefully never will have to, understand a life that is filled with so much pain that only people like Jimmy could understand. Not filled with physical pain, but the pain of fighting. Killing the enemy who is just like you, and seeing everyone around you on the ground, rotting, bloodied and battered. Jimmy was so damaged he considered those who died as the lucky ones, and having to go home only to feel nothing, with those you hold dear, encapsulated a hell on earth. What Jimmy had become inside was a punishment far worse than any leg injury anyone in the war had suffered. Season 2 would come to a climactic ending with Jimmy Dormy finally getting his release from life and the prison that had captured his soul on Earth. But that's not where this video ends, because when I kept thinking about it, I thought of another character that I had somewhat forgotten about, even though his story is probably more amazing. He's a man Jimmy befriended and met as early as season 1, I think episode 7. That man was none other than the marksman, half-faced Richard Harrow, played by Jack Huston. Jimmy and Richard met while waiting to get psychologically evaluated as war veterans. It is in this moment where Jimmy confides with Richard that they need to be their own person and forget the war, which for both of them is a first. Jimmy had never confided in anyone, and Richard was way too stunned to do the same. Jimmy would take Richard under his wing and use his skills as a hitman. When Nucky would call Jimmy to set up the trap for his murder, both Richard and Jimmy recognized the trap. Richard, who had remained loyal to his only friend, offered to go, but Jimmy told him to stay and try to forget the war. That was the last time Richard got to speak to the only person left who understood him. 1 year after Jimmy's passing, Richard is set up with Jimmy's mom to take care of a brothel, and to watch Jimmy's son, Tommy. Richard would attend the Wounded Veterans Legion of Support. I guess I should mention at this point that Richard had lost half of his face during the war and now covers it using a mask to hide the horror. Obviously a very scarring aspect of his time fighting. When Richard did attend the meeting to try and once again connect with those who knew his troubles like Jimmy, he would instead be harassed by a drunk man named Paul, who had lost his son in the war, causing him to become deeply depressed, taking it into alcohol. Paul ends up injured in a bar fight, so Richard takes him home after having pity on him, even after their conflict. While dropping Paul off, Richard would meet his daughter, Julia. Immediately he fell in love with her, and the two would begin a relationship even against Paul's wishes. At the end of the season 3, Richard would rescue Tommy from the brothel during a shootout and takes him to Julia so that he can be better cared for. Richard doesn't get any more screen time until season 4 when he goes to his home where his sister still resides. Even with someone he grew up with, Richard still stays to himself, and after being attacked, decides he must go as he only brings his sister trouble. Before he goes, his sister hugs him and says, "Richard, you need to bring yourself to account." A line that hits deep as even his sister struggles to accept what the war has done to Richard, a war that created a killer and a broken man both physically and mentally. Richard would head back to Atlantic City, and when he arrived, he would bump into Paul, who tells him he's dying from liver cirrhosis. Richard would immediately go to Julia, who's fighting a custody battle to keep Tommy at this time. The two decided to get married in order to have a better case for getting Tommy, and also because they have a real care for each other that carried over even during Richard's absence. If Jimmy's mom is to be placed in prison for murder, Richard and Julia think they can get Tommy permanently. It just so happens, too, that his mom is claiming her son Jimmy just recently died to overdose. Richard, knowing the events and what had happened, wants to disprove this so that they can retain Tommy. In order to disprove it and display that she's actually a murderer, Richard goes to Nucky and trades a kill for the location of Jimmy's body. Nucky delivers and his body's discovered. Unfortunately for Richard, the target he is to kill is a high-profile man named Narcisse. It is at this point that Richard's story reached its happy ending and would brutally turn sour. In his assassination attempt on Narcisse, he hesitates and accidentally shoots an innocent girl. Richard is finished. After having thoughts of taking his own life in the past and actually going to act on it in the woods until a man discovered him and saved him, Richard is finally done. Fortunately, we don't have to see that depressing scene of him lying down with the gun in his mouth again, but we don't fully escape. Richard is chased from the club and in an escape is hit by several bullets. Richard makes his way to the family farm where Julia and his sister and Tommy are waiting. Then when the camera pans to Richard, his face is shown to be healed. A quick cut back to reality forces us to see Richard didn't make it back, but instead made it to the boardwalk where he sat mortally wounded until he passed peacefully. It originally did not seem like a happy ending to me, but after some thought, it is the happiest ending Richard could have gotten. This is the ending Richard got from Jimmy. Jimmy gave him the confidence to strive for everything that makes a man whole. Richard made a friend, he fell in love, was married, and even had a family. Unlike Jimmy, who died in hell, Richard made it all the way to heaven at the time of his passing. In the end, Richard was still broken like Jimmy, a war-torn veteran who not only suffered physically but heavily mentally. Someone who could see no value in life, just another soldier who died in the trenches. Although, unlike Jimmy, Richard was revived. Sadly, not for very long, but long enough for him to find that other half of his life he lost. In the dark shadow of war, there are no happy endings. What remains are the haunting echoes of suffering and sacrifice, as vividly exemplified by the tales of James Jimmy Darmody and Richard Harrow in Boardwalk Empire. These characters, though fictional, stand as solemn reminders of the real-life heroes who bear the weight of trauma and loss far beyond our comprehension. Their stories, filled with tragedy and pain, leave an enduring mark on our hearts and minds, stirring emotions that resonate long after the credits roll. The somber theme of their experiences serve as a stark reminder that the toll of war extends well beyond the battlefield. It touches the lives of victims, soldiers, and even those who survive it all, casting a long shadow of suffering. As we immerse ourselves in these narratives, we are compelled to reflect on the profound sacrifices made by individuals who gave everything for the world we now inhabit. In a world filled with fiction, it is a painful reality that people like Jimmy and Richard exist. Individuals who have endured unimaginable hardships and carry the scars of their experiences. Boardwalk Empire, with its brilliant storytelling and the masterful portrayal of these two characters, will forever be remembered in the landscape of television. While it may not hold the title of best series, to me at least, it remains the most remembered series I've ever watched, a testament to the power of its narrative and the resonance of its characters. In the end, we are left with a profound silence, contemplating the profound losses and unspoken horrors of the war, both on screen and in the world around us. Boardwalk Empire reminds us that in the face of such suffering, real heroes emerge. Characters like Jimmy and Richard, whose stories will forever haunt our souls, compelling us to honor and remember the real-life counterparts who experienced the unrelenting brutality of war. I appreciate you all for viewing. I didn't go too deep into the both backstories, more of Richard's, less of Jimmy's, because if you did want to watch it, I didn't want to fully spoil it. Just kind of give you a little peek into how it develops certain characters into being somewhat masterpieces. I watched this show after watching things like Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, The Sopranos, just amazing shows, and while those shows I definitely think might have been better besides maybe The Sopranos, this show really left an impact. Every time something would happen like Jimmy's ending or Richard's ending, I would feel stunned. I would just feel it coming because they weren't allowed to have happy endings. People that suffer that much can't just forget the war. And that's just what makes it so impactful. And I really think you should at least give those scenes a watch if you don't plan on watching the actual show. But anyway, I should probably just outro the video. So yeah, once again, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think about Boardwalk Empire. I might talk about the show as a whole later and about its theming and whatnot, but we'll see on that. And yeah, you have a good day, and until next time.